Homem expulsa velho do curral sem piedade, até o dia em que o gado se recusa a comer. When that finger pointed straight at him, Silas didn't back down. He didn't answer. He didn't raise his voice. He stood still, hands crossed in front of his body, staring at the packed dirt floor of the corral he knew every inch of. He heard the words without blinking. And when it was all over, he gathered what was his and walked away the way he always walked. Slow, unhurried, never rushing. On the outside, it looked like nothing had happened to him. On the inside, it was another story. What brought those two men to that moment wasn't a disagreement over one afternoon. It was a pressure that had been building in silence for weeks, each day adding a little more weight to something no one wanted to name while it could still be ignored. And on the day it finally came to the surface, it came with a force neither of them truly expected. To understand how he got there, you have to go back a few weeks. Back to the day that unfamiliar car came up the dirt road to the ranch and changed everything that had been quiet. Silas had woken up early, as always. He got up slowly from the cot, ran a hand over his shaved head, walked to the little window in his room, and looked out at the pasture beginning to light up outside. There was a smell in the air, different from usual. Not the smell of wet earth or cut grass. It was one of those smells you can't quite identify, but it makes you stand still for 1 second longer before starting your day. He put on his favorite shirt, the one with the faded check pattern his daughter had been trying to throw away for years, set his straw hat on his head, and headed toward the corral. The cows were already waiting for him on the other side of the fence. They always waited for him. It had been that way for 53 years. That's where he saw the car. A new silver pickup truck, the bed still clean without the red dust the dirt road leaves on everything that passes through it. And standing outside, looking at the barn with a notepad in his hand, was a young man Silas had never seen before. His name was Arthur Sterling, son of the man who had bought the ranch 3 months earlier. Arthur had spent the last few years studying in the Midwest, had gotten a degree in veterinary medicine from West Oak Agricultural College, had a specialization, had a row of certificates hanging on a wall. His father had invested all of that in him, and now he was sending him to take charge of the herd as proof that the investment had been worth something. Arthur was around 30 with well-kept dark hair, a teal veterinary uniform and a stethoscope hanging around his neck. He looked at the corral with the expression of someone sizing up a situation, not yet decided on what to do. He seemed to know a lot. He seemed sure of it. Silas approached the way he approached everything, calmly. "Good morning." Arthur looked up from the notepad for a second. "You're the one who takes care of the cattle here." "I've taken care of them for 53 years, Silas replied, not with exaggerated pride, just stating a fact the way someone answers that the sun rises in the east. Arthur made a sound with his mouth and went back to his notepad. It wasn't a response. It was the noise of someone who heard but wasn't really paying attention. That's how it all began. In the first few days, Silas stayed in his space. He let the young man do the inspections, watched from a distance, waited to be called when they needed him. He had learned over a lifetime that new people in a workplace need time to find their own rhythm. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a city man show up full of theory and have to learn that cows don't read books. But Arthur wasn't looking for rhythm. He was looking for control. In the second week, he arrived with a printed spreadsheet and taped it to the barn door. It had schedules for everything: feeding, vaccinations, milking, intervals, everything on paper, everything calculated. Silas looked at the spreadsheet for a long while. Then he went to Arthur. "Doctor, the afternoon feeding time is different from what they're used to." Arthur didn't stop what he was doing, which was examining the ear of one of the younger cows. "It's the correct time, calculated by the average metabolism of the herd. I understand, but these cows have their quirks. Patches, for example, gets restless if she doesn't eat before 4. Arthur stopped. He looked at the old man, and the way he looked wasn't the look of someone considering what he'd heard. It was the look of someone tolerating it. "The cow doesn't have a name," he said, "and metabolism isn't a quirk. Follow the spreadsheet." Silas turned around without answering. He had also learned that there are times when the mouth needs to stay shut so the eyes can stay open. But the friction kept growing the way things grow when no one admits they're growing, slowly, in silence, like a root that keeps pushing a rock apart without making a sound until the day the rock splits. Arthur changed the feed to a formula a supplier had recommended. He ordered the barn washed with products Silas had never seen around there. He forbade the animals from being loose in the pasture after a certain hour, because it conflicted with the spreadsheet, and with each of these changes, Silas tried to say something. Never aggressively, never raising his voice, just saying what he saw, what he knew. Each time, Arthur listened the way you listen to background noise. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, especially, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out since we're just getting started. Now continuing on, until that Tuesday morning that changed everything. Silas had arrived earlier than usual because one of the heifers hadn't eaten well the day before. He wanted to check how she was doing before the day got too hot. He went into the barn, walked to the back, crouched beside the animal, and began running his hands over her body with the attention of someone reading something that isn't written anywhere. That's when he heard the footsteps. Arthur walked in with 2 new employees he'd hired. He stopped when he saw Silas crouched on the ground. "What are you doing here?" "The young one didn't eat right yesterday. I came to see if she was okay." "I already evaluated the herd early this morning. There's nothing abnormal." "Doctor, her breathing is a little—" "I said everything is normal." Silas went quiet. The 2 new employees looked at the ground. Arthur took a step forward. It was a step that carried more than physical distance. It was the step of someone who had already made a decision and had only come to carry it out. "I need you to understand something once and for all. This place is going to run professionally. I have training, I have method, I have responsibility over this herd, and I can't have someone in here going against every decision I make in front of my employees." Silas stood up slowly. He looked at the young veterinarian without anger, with a seriousness that came from deep within. "I never went against you in front of anyone, Doctor. I only asked questions. Questions that cast doubt on my authority. Questions that have to do with the well-being of the cattle." And that's when Arthur pointed his finger. A brusque gesture with no room to turn back. "You don't set foot in this corral anymore. As of today, you're limited to outside tasks. If you don't accept it, I'll talk to my father and we'll find another solution." I need to pause here for a second, because this scene, this old man in his straw hat looking at that finger pointed in his face, after 53 years taking care of that place, gives you a tightness in your chest that takes a while to pass. Silas didn't answer. He picked up his hat, which he'd taken off while examining the heifer, put it back on his head and walked away, without running, without answering back, without showing what he was feeling. It was the attitude of someone who had lived long enough to know that one's own dignity doesn't need to be defended out loud to exist. The 2 new employees exchanged glances. Neither said anything. What happened in the following days was slow, so slow that Arthur didn't even notice at first. On the first day after Silas left the corral, the cattle ate normally. The veterinarian felt he had made the right decision, that the old man's presence was an obstacle he had finally removed. On the second day, Patches, the oldest cow in the herd, a big black and white one that had been at Oak Creek Ranch for nearly 10 years, stayed leaning against the back fence and didn't touch the trough all afternoon. Arthur went over, examined the animal, found nothing wrong. He noted it in the spreadsheet as a normal variation. On the third day, 3 more cows stopped eating. They stayed quiet, close to one another, eyes lowered, leaving the feed untouched. Arthur started investigating. He checked the feed formula, sent the water for analysis, checked the barn's temperature, measured the humidity, ran tests on the animals. Everything within standard. He found nothing wrong in what could be measured. But the cattle wouldn't eat. On the 5th day, there were 7 animals refusing feed, and those that did eat were eating far less than what was recorded in the spreadsheets. Arthur called the employees, rearranged the schedules, tried a different feed as an alternative, moved the mineral salt to a different spot in the corral. No change made any difference. And then came Martha. Martha was 68 years old, white hair pinned at the nape of her neck, and had worked as a cook at Oak Creek Ranch for nearly 3 decades. She had seen ranch owners come and go, seen ranch hands arrive and leave, seen animals born and raised in that pasture, and she had a way of saying things that didn't leave much room for argument. She knocked on the barn door one night when Arthur was still there, alone with his papers and spreadsheets. She walked in without waiting to be called, set a mug of coffee on the counter, and stood looking at him with the expression of someone who had decided to say something and wasn't going to leave without saying it. "I've got something to say about old Silas." Arthur looked at the mug, then at her. "Martha, I already said the matter is closed." "You said so, but the cattle aren't eating." There was something in her manner that made Arthur go quiet. It wasn't her voice, which was low. It was the firmness, the kind of firmness that only appears in someone who has nothing left to prove. Martha pulled up a small stool and sat down like someone who had all the time in the world. "Old Silas came to Oak Creek Ranch at 18. He worked here for the grandfather of the man your father bought the property from, then for the son, then for the grandson. 3 generations of different owners, Doctor. And you know what never changed?" Arthur didn't answer. "The herd. All these cattle have blood from animals he raised. Patches, do you know how she got here? He attended her birth, stayed up all night. The cow knows his smell, his voice, his step inside the barn. When he came in each morning, they would get up. When he hummed that tuneless thing only he knew how to hum, they would go quiet." There was a different silence after those words. "Cows aren't machines, Doctor. They feel things. And these cattle are missing the one who never abandoned them." Arthur stared at the counter for a while. Martha got up, adjusted her apron. "Coffee's there. Don't let it get cold." And she left without looking back. There are things you hear and feel like you know that pain from somewhere. Silas spent 50 years being invisible to a lot of people who should have paid more attention. And sometimes a 68-year-old woman in a kitchen apron speaks more truth than any spreadsheet can hold. Arthur stayed alone in the barn for a long time. Patches was on the other side of the fence. Her big eyes looked at him with a calm that seemed almost like a question. He stood up, walked to the fence, and placed his hand on the animal's muzzle with care. The cow didn't move away. She stood still, waiting for something he didn't know how to give. "What do you want?" he asked in a low voice. The question hung in the air, but it stayed inside him too. The next morning, Arthur went to the house out back where Silas lived. It was early. The sun was still weak and there was a fine drizzle. He knocked on the door with a hesitation that wasn't usual for him. Silas opened after a while, plaid shirt, hat not yet on. He looked at Arthur with a calm that was almost hard to bear, because there was no anger in it, no irony, nothing but a simple waiting. "Doctor." Arthur stood on the doorstep. He didn't ask to come in. "The cattle stopped eating," he said. "I know." "You know?" "Martha tells me things." There was a pause between them, a distance that wasn't just physical. 7 animals without eating properly for 5 days. I ran all the tests. The feed is correct. The water is clean. The barn is up to standard. Silas shook his head slowly. "And what do you think is missing?" The question was simple. It wasn't ironic, it wasn't a provocation. It was genuine. And that was what bothered Arthur the most, because genuineness can't be argued with. He took a deep breath. "I came to ask if you could come back." The silence that followed had a different weight. Silas looked at the sky for a moment. Then he looked at Arthur. "You didn't ask if I wanted to come back. You asked if I could." Arthur stood still. That distinction, that small detail, hit him like a bucket of cold water. "You're right," he said, and it cost him to say it truly, with the voice he had. "I came asking the wrong question." Silas waited. I would like you to come back, if you want to." The old man looked at him for a while. It wasn't a look of judgment. It was a look of assessment, the kind of look that comes from someone who has seen too many people promise one thing and do another. "There's a condition," said Silas. "What?" "You explained to me what you wrote down in all those spreadsheets, and I explain what I learned in these 53 years. We find a middle ground." Arthur could have backed away. He could have retreated into his own training and insisted he was right. But 7 cows weren't eating, and he didn't have a technical answer for that. "Deal," he said. Silas went to get his straw hat. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out now continuing. What happened when Silas walked into the corral that morning is one of those things you need to see to understand. But I'll try. When he passed through the barn door, Patches lifted her head. It was slow, like someone waking from a deep sleep. Her ears moved. She made a low sound, a moo almost without strength, like a recognition. The others started to stir as well. Silas didn't run. He didn't call any of them by name right away. He just walked down the center aisle the way he always walked. Calm step, loose shoulders, and he was humming that thing without a defined melody that Martha had mentioned. An old tune, without clear lyrics, that he had learned from an uncle when he was a boy and had never been able to let go of. Arthur stood still at the entrance, watching. Patches approached the fence. She pressed her muzzle against Silas's hand when he got close. She stayed there while he spoke softly, words that didn't reach where Arthur was standing. In less than 20 minutes, 4 of the 7 cows that hadn't eaten made their way to the troughs, slowly, without urgency. But they went. I had to take a deep breath here. Really. Because there's something that's hard to explain, but that anyone who has ever taken care of someone knows. There's a presence that gives back the will to live of a living being. It's not magic. It's a bond. It's time spent without asking for anything in return. Arthur stood there for a good while watching, notepad in hand but writing nothing. Then he walked over to Silas. "Can you explain to me how this works?" Silas took his hand from Patches and looked at the young veterinarian. There was an almost surprised look on his face. He wasn't used to being asked with that kind of genuineness, without the weight of authority bearing down on him. "Cows are creatures of habit and bond," he said. "They form ties with whoever takes care of them. When that tie gets cut all of a sudden, they get stressed. Stress kills their appetite. That's not on your spreadsheet, but it happens." Arthur stared at Patches for a while. "It is," he said quietly. "It's in the book. I just didn't connect one thing to the other." It was that moment, that admission out loud, with no beating around the bush, no excuse tacked on. It was the first brick of something different between the two men. In the days that followed, Silas went back to his routine. But it was a different routine because Arthur was at his side, not in front of him. He asked before changing things. He listened to the answer before deciding. And when he disagreed, he offered an argument instead of shutting down the conversation with a pointed finger. It wasn't easy. There were days when the two of them really butted heads. Silas wasn't the type to stay quiet forever either, and once he felt respected, he began to speak his mind more clearly. Sometimes he was right, sometimes Arthur was. But it was exactly in that give and take that things started to fall into place. The heifer Silas had tried to examine on the day of his expulsion showed a real problem a week later, a mild inflammation in the hoof that had gone unnoticed in Arthur's exams, because he had no baseline for how she normally behaved. Silas had spotted it by the way she stepped. Arthur treated it with the right method. The animal recovered within a few days. They started working like this. Silas would flag what he noticed. Arthur would investigate with the tools he had. It was an odd partnership, made up of opposite temperaments and very different stories. But it worked. Martha watched it all from the kitchen window, with a smile she kept only for when things went right. She said nothing about that nighttime conversation she'd had with Arthur. She didn't need to. The result was walking around the corral every day. Almost a month after the expulsion incident, Arthur's father came to visit Oak Creek Ranch. He was a man used to thinking of everything as an investment, and he went straight for the numbers: herd weight, production, forecast for the next period. Arthur presented the reports. The numbers were good, better than the initial projection. The father looked at his son with a silent approval that Arthur sensed before it was spoken. "You're running this place well." Arthur stayed quiet for a second. Then he said, "I have help." The father waited. "There's a man who's worked here for over 50 years. He knows things about this herd that aren't written down anywhere. Without him, I would have lost part of the cattle in the first month." The father looked toward the corral where Silas was at that moment, checking the troughs from outside with his usual calm. "An old man like that can still handle the work?" Arthur followed his father's gaze. "He handles more than most of the new guys I interviewed." There was a pause. "I want to formalize his employment here, make it official, with the rights he should have had a long time ago." The father raised an eyebrow. "That cost money." "I know, and it's worth it." That wasn't just about cattle. It was about Arthur learning something no college teaches clearly enough, that respect is also a form of responsibility, and that competence without humility breaks things that take a long time to fix. The father looked at his son for a moment that seemed longer than it was, and then he nodded. It was Martha who brought the news to Silas, because Arthur didn't quite know how to say it without it feeling awkward. She went over to where he was, said 3 sentences, and walked back to the kitchen without waiting for a reply. Silas stood there for a while, looking out at the pasture. Then he took off his straw hat, ran his hand slowly over his head, and put the hat back on. After a moment he called Patches by name in a low voice, and she came. A few weeks later, on an afternoon when the sun was sinking and painting the pasture that shade of orange that makes everything feel quieter, Arthur stepped out of the office with no spreadsheet in hand and walked over to the corral just to stay for a while. Silas was sitting on an old wooden bench outside the barn, watching the herd. Patches was lying nearby, calm, the way she gets when she's satisfied with the day. Arthur sat down on the ground right there. He didn't say anything for a while. After a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, Silas spoke without looking at him. "You know what I like most about this time of day?" "No." "That they get like this. You look at them, and you know everything's all right with them. There's nothing better in the work of caring for an animal than that moment." Arthur kept staring at the herd. "How do you stand doing the same thing for 50 years without getting tired?" Silas smiled. A small smile, one that opened slowly, the way the smiles of people who have lived a lot tend to open. "Because it's never the same thing. Every day is different. Every animal has a different day. Whoever thinks it's all the same hasn't been paying attention." That answer hung in the air between the two of them for a good long while. And on that afternoon, in the silence of that orange pasture, 2 very different men sat side by side, without needing to settle anything else, without needing to prove anything else, and simply stayed there. Listening to the same wind, watching the same herd, each one carrying what they had learned from the other. Sometimes that's exactly what calls life back to its rightful place. End of story. Silas spent 53 years caring for a herd that had no way of speaking, but that knew exactly who it needed. And Arthur needed to see that happen to understand that knowledge isn't measured only by what fits on a diploma. Sometimes what's worth the most comes from years of presence, of attention, of care that never asked for recognition in return. Tell me in the comments what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. What touched you the most? Do you think Arthur did the right thing by owning up to his mistake the way he did? I'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for the company, truly. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories coming your way.